The first piece here in terms of law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So this is just the First Amendment. Each of these is kind of the three key points that we're looking at. There are two important parts to this first clause here. This blue part here is called the religious clause, religious freedom. It's got two pieces to it. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion. In the language of the day, this meant Congress can never create an official state religion. You cannot say the Methodists, that's the official church of the United States. The Catholics, that's the official church. They can't do that. That's what establishment of religion means. Over time, it has come to be interpreted as, does the government seem to provide a systematic benefit to one religion over another religion? That's a more complicated question. The second part of the Religion Amendment has to do with protecting the free exercise of religion. That has to do with you, your ability to express yourself and to live your life based on your religious values. What I'm going to do is post from the 11 o'clock class the section of the lecture in which I talked about that. So I'm going to develop that. I developed that this morning. I'm going to develop this part for this class. So I'll post this section for you here where I develop this more thoroughly. And I'll have that up later today or tomorrow. The second part has to do with abridging the freedom of speech and of the press. This essentially says you have the right to express yourself. You have the right to say anything in politics that you want to say. The third part says you have the right to assemble peaceably. Now, the important thing about all of these rights, and any rights that we're talking about, is that they are never completely absolute. There are always exceptions. There are always circumstances in which some of these rights cannot be completely exercised. So you have freedom of speech, but you can't really say anything you want to. So you can't really advocate the violent overthrow of the United States government. You can't do that. You cannot yell fire in a crowded theater or cause a panic that makes people go crazy and causes loss of life. You can't. That kind of speech is not protected. But speech that's highly critical of Donald Trump's State of the Union address tonight, you can do that all day long. Okay? And he can't do anything about it except scream and threaten. But he can't really do anything. You can assemble peaceably. Now, peaceable assembly means there can be reasonable regulation on assemblies. You can't just completely assemble and start a whole protest march without any kind of interface with the local government, because the government also has an interest in maintaining domestic tranquility. Right? So you have to get permits, but those permits have to be available to lots of people. So this first part of the First Amendment covers religious freedom. It says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Now there are two parts to this, the way that has historically been interpreted. One says, make no law regarding the establishment of religion. That's called the Establishment Clause. The phrase that says, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, is called the Free Exercise Clause. So the way that this developed over time was interpreting these as two separate concepts. Now, some legal scholars, like Stephen Carter at Yale University, says that's basically a misunderstanding of this whole phrase. This is an entire sentence. The second clause clearly pertains to the first clause. So really, this is one big clause. But that's a minority view in the legal community. This goes to the concept that we have in our minds about separation of church and state. Right? So this phrase, establishment of religion, in the language of the time, what this meant was the government cannot set up its own religion. Establishment of religion has to do with a specific government endorsement of a religious sect or denomination. So the idea coming out of England was that you have the Anglican Church, and that is the Church of England. And coming out of France, you have the Roman Catholic Church is the Church of France. And coming out of Germany, you have the Lutheran Church of Germany, right? That's the church of those governments. This part of the Constitution says our government will never do that. We are not going to establish that is, specifically endorse a particular religious sect or denomination. The concept of separation of church and state is not, in this phrase, a wall of separation between church and state, a wall of separation, separation of church and state, that occurs, as you know, nowhere in the Constitution. Those phrases do not exist in the Constitution. That phrase is actually pulled out of a quote from a letter written by Thomas Jefferson in 1801. So this is a famous letter to the Danbury Baptists. And it's useful for us to see how Thomas Jefferson was using this quotation. He actually got this quotation. It's a metaphor. When you think about church, when you think about state, he's using a metaphor about a wall between the two. He's not talking about a literal wall, right? Unlike some literal walls we can talk about. He's not talking about a literal wall. He's talking about a figurative wall, right? That divides the church and the state. That metaphor was developed actually 160 years earlier in 1643 by a minister out of Rhode Island named Roger Williams. And in his sermon, he develops this metaphor of separation, a wall of separation between church and state. And basically his argument goes like this. The whole world is a garden. And the government manages the garden. But in the middle of the garden, there is this little piece of the garden that has a big wall around it, and that's the church. And obviously he's a minister in Rhode Island in the 1600s. He's talking about the Christian church, right? But this applies to any church. So there's a wall of separation protecting the church from the all-encompassing, all-encroaching government. So he creates this metaphor with this idea that in the midst of a society, you've got the church and it needs to be protected from the government. That's his metaphor. So the letter that's written by the Danbury Baptists to Thomas Jefferson basically says, look, we know you're an atheist and you hate God. They don't say that, but it's kind of between the lines. What they say is, we're concerned that you are going to use the power of the government to start telling churches what they can and can't do. And if you go online, read the letter that the Danbury Baptists wrote to Thomas Jefferson before he wrote his letter. Lots of people read Jefferson's letter. Not too many people read the letter that prompted his letter. Look at the question he was asked. He was asked, are you going to use the power of the federal government to tell the churches what they can and can't do? Jefferson's response was, I can't, because there's a wall of separation between the church and the state. The question he's asked is the government going to impose its will on the churches? And Jefferson's response was, there's a wall of separation. The government has no authority over the churches. This concern had nothing to do with churches influencing the government. The question that prompted the phrase was, is the government going to impose its will on the churches? So we have this idea in the 21st century that when we talk about separation of church and state, that we're talking about protecting the government somehow from the will of religion. But that is absolutely the opposite problem that this phrase was coined to deal with. The original phrase was coined to deal with, how do you keep the government from being oppressive on the churches, imposing its will on the churches? This is also completely separate from the separation of religion and politics. Right? Separation of church and state, that metaphor has to do with the institution of churches and their relationship to the institutions of government. Right? Like the Roman Catholic Church telling the United States government what it has to do. When John F. Kennedy was running for president, he had to specifically address this question because there were people who were saying, my God, if John F. Kennedy gets elected president, the Pope is actually going to be running the country. That's a serious concern. Right? When you look, the first Roman Catholic candidate was Al Smith in 1928. There were crazy conspiracy theories about how there was going to be a tunnel from the Roman Catholic embassy in Washington, D.C., going directly to the White House, and then they were going to have to reprint all the money to incorporate the rosary, the Roman Catholic kind of their standard prayer, into the U.S. currency. I mean, that sounds kind of funny to us, but this was a serious opposition to Roman Catholics holding office, right? So the concern was that religious institutions are going to be bossing around the government. This is a completely separate problem from, can you, as a person of faith, allow your religious values into the public square for you to try to lobby for the people that you want, lobby for the legislation that you want? Or if you're a person of no faith, can your lack of faith, your lack of belief in a God, can that in any way be used to hinder your ability to speak into the public arena? Right? This is not what it's talking about. This is talking about institutions, formal institutions. It's not talking about people of different religious faiths expressing themselves in politics. Questions or thoughts? So then in that context of what separation of church and state means, let's look at these, summarize these very specifically. The Establishment Clause says, the government may not establish an official religion. That is, you cannot say this is going to be the official church of the United States. That's what the word establishment means in legal terms. Establishment means creating an official religion or an official church of the United States. Even the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. isn't really an official church of the United States. And the people who wrote this, and for 150 years after that, nobody had any problem with putting up statues of Moses or statues of the Ten Commandments or putting up crosses on public lands. They had no problem with this. They did not see that as establishing the religion in the United States, establishing an official religion of the United States. It wasn't until the last 50 years or so that people have started to become uncomfortable with the idea that government sets up a cross as a memorial on public land like they did in Grand Haven. And people get concerned about that. Or putting up a Ten Commandments statue on the state capitol grounds. And people now start to see that as an establishment of religion, but for the first 150 years, people didn't even give that a second thought. That was not the issue. Most often, this has to do now with somehow the government, through its laws, giving a systematic advantage to one religion over another. And so when you have somehow the government creates a policy that looks like it's giving an advantage to Christians, then people say that's a problem with that. So a state employee or a government employee, like a football coach, can be fired for praying with his students before the football game, and was. Because it was seen as somehow this agent of the state, this employee of the government, a football coach in a high school, was establishing a religion, giving preferential treatment to one religion over another. And so under the current climate, that's being increasingly restrained under the concept of the Establishment Clause. The Free Exercise Clause has to do with, what do you do with that as an individual? Not as an employee of the government, like a football coach, but what do you do when you're just speaking as an individual? It doesn't restrict the football coach from praying or going to church. It just says in his capacity as the high school football coach, he can't pray with students. Free exercise has to do with, what do you do in your private time? Not in your official capacity as a government employee. So in this case, government may not restrict the free exercise of religion. That means whatever your sincerely held religious beliefs are, the government cannot pass laws that restrict your exercise of those sincerely held religious beliefs. Now, this is not an absolute thing. Antisocial behaviors, so let's say if you adhere to a religion that says we believe in human sacrifice, the government has an interest in prohibiting human sacrifice, and so the government can prohibit that. They can't prohibit your believing in human sacrifice. They can prohibit your actually acting on it. So there are some kinds of actions that may be provided under the rubric or on the guidance of a religious belief, and the government has the ability to say there are some of these that are going to be really antisocial, that conflict with other kinds of rights and other people's fundamental rights. So we can then restrict those, even if you claim a religious basis. But what does free exercise actually mean? What does it mean to exercise your religion freely? Well, historically, this has been very broad. It means that pretty much whatever you want to do related to your religion, as long as it's not considered somehow antisocial, can be done. Okay? But Mormons were heavily persecuted because their belief in polygamy and belief in a different kind of God system than Christianity, that was seen as not a legitimate exercise of religion, and so Mormons were severely persecuted by the government for their religious beliefs. So, but historically, it's been treated really broadly. Under the Obama administration, the movement of the administration was to think about how did we define free exercise, and they chose to start exercising that free exercise of religion. What that means is freedom to worship however you want to when you go worship. So it had to do with the government's limitations on your exercise as an individual. Was really the government can't tell you how to worship on Sunday morning or on Saturday or on Wednesday. But anything else in your life, that's fair game. That, especially if it involves interacting with other people, your free exercise of religion is constrained to a particular area of your life that is related to what we're going to think about in terms of worshiping at a house of worship. So that created certain problems, because what it meant was, under the Obama administration, is that if people said, my religion influences all areas of my life, the way that I conduct my business, the way that I interact with my students, the way that I interact with my neighbors, the Obama administration said, you know what, we have the right to address those areas that involve interacting with other people, because that's not freedom of worship. Worship however you want to. When it comes to interacting with one another, that's fair game for us. So that was, I mean, you could look this up. This was a clear break from the way that freedom of expression has been, religious expression has been incorporated over the years. So when Donald Trump took office, he is no great friend of religion. He's no great religious person. But his policy was taking that back. So his policy was working backwards, saying free exercise of religion means how religion influences your life and your interaction with other people. And the government cannot restrict that, as opposed to merely dealing with how you choose to worship. So the reaction against this, so for people who like the Obama administration's interpretation, the government can regulate how you interact with people. You can't use a religious excuse for interacting with other people. The Trump administration simply went back to what had always been the interpretation. But they create a backlash, because now in the current political climate, there are certain actions and there are certain behaviors that people want to take that their religion tells them is the right way to act, that now counteracts people who had freedoms that were expanded under this concept. So when we think about Jack Phillips, the baker from Colorado, who said, my religious belief does not allow me to participate in the celebration of a same-sex wedding. I'm not going to bake a cake for the same-sex wedding. It enabled him to say, this is my free exercise of religion. Whereas the Obama administration concept of freedom of worship said, no, your conduct of your business does not apply to the extension of recognition of same-sex marriage. And so if you are restricting your own company's business, you're discriminating illegitimately against other people's exercise of their rights. So this is a real conflict in terms of people of any faith who make changes in the way they behave with other people based upon their religious beliefs. Constraining freedom of worship enables the government to manage that a little bit more thoroughly. Thoughts? When the Supreme Court ruled on that particular case, they did not take a position on whether or not the law in Colorado that restricted under which he was prosecuted for violating the civil rights of the same-sex couple, they passed on evaluating that. What they said was that the way that the Colorado Civil Rights Commission had treated him showed that they were prejudiced against religion, and that he was being persecuted because of his religious beliefs and prosecuted under the law because of his religious beliefs. So they said, we're not going to take that case because that's wrong. But he's back at it because as soon as he went back into business, another couple came in and asked the same thing. And so now he's back up being charged with violating civil rights. Only now the Civil Rights Commission has to be more careful about the way they talk about his breaking that law. It's a real challenge because you have what the framers saw as a fundamental right, his freedom of expression and his freedom of religious expression, with the civil rights that are granted by the government. If the civil right granted by the government is the right for same-sex couples to marry, how does that interact with the natural right of the individual to their free expression of their religion? That's where a lot of these conflicts happen. Individuals' expressions of their rights compared with the rights that are granted by the government. You just end up with lots of conflicts that are like this. I don't know how that's going to end up, but it's the nature of a lot of the conflicts that we're seeing today. Questions?